Welcome back, everybody. Looks like we're taking a deep dive into Thinkin' in Systems by Daniela Meadows today.
A fantastic choice.
Yeah, it really is. I'm excited for this one.
It's considered like the go-to guide for really grasping how systems function.
Right. And we're going to be trying to answer some big questions today, like what are the fundamental pieces that make up a system?
Yeah.
How can we spot them out in the real world?
Yeah. And how can understanding these systems help us tackle complex problems? We'll be looking at common patterns of behavior.
Right, like those system archetypes.
Exactly.
And of course, we want to figure out where those leverage points are, the places where we can make a real difference.
Absolutely. How can we step in and make things better?
So first things first, what exactly do we mean when we say system? It feels like one of those words that gets thrown around a lot,
Oh, it definitely is.
but it's not always clear what it actually means.
Yeah, it's more than just a random collection of
Yeah.
things, right? Meadows makes it really clear that a system is a set of interconnected elements that are organized to achieve something. There's a purpose behind it.
Okay, so there's a purpose. Got it.
And you could think of something like a tree.
Okay, a tree, like all those different parts, the roots, the trunk, the
No,
leaves.
Exactly. All those pieces working together.
Working together for a reason, to
Yeah.
grow, to capture sunlight, to reproduce. It's not just a random pile of wood.
That's it. It's a system with a function.
And I bet we can see this kind of interconnectedness everywhere if we start looking for it.
You're absolutely right. Think about a university. It's a system.
Oh, yeah, definitely a system or an economy.
Absolutely. Even our own bodies are complex systems.
So if we're going to understand systems, it sounds like we can't just focus on the individual parts. We need to see the bigger picture.
Right. Meadows highlights these three key things.
Mm-hmm.
The elements, the interconnections between them.
And the purpose, the function that brings it all together.
You got it.
This is pretty profound, actually. I mean, it's like a whole new way of looking at the world. And I'm already starting to see how easily we could get things wrong if we don't take this systems approach.
Well, it happens all the time, doesn't it? We get fixated on trying to fix individual components
Right, without seeing the knock-on effect.
without understanding how those changes will ripple through the entire system. And that can lead to some, well, unintended consequences.
Can you give me an example, like a real world scenario where this kind of thinking goes wrong?
Sure. Imagine a company. They're trying to boost sales.
Okay.
So they slash prices, ramp up advertising. They're hyper-focused on the sales department.
Right. Sounds like a reasonable strategy.
But they might be completely overlooking other crucial factors,
Like what?
like production bottlenecks or customer service issues, things that are actually holding them back.
Ah, so they're so focused on one part of the system that
Yeah.
they're missing the bigger picture?
Exactly. And that's where Meadows' idea of stocks and flows comes in handy. It's like a way to visualize how all those different elements interact.
Oh, yeah, the bathtub analogy.
You remember it.
I do. It's a good one.
So the water in the bathtub is a stock,
Okay.
something that builds up over time. And the rate at which it flows in or out, that's the flow.
So if we want to change the amount of water in the tub, we can either adjust the inflow or the outflow.
Exactly. You got it. But here's where things get even more fascinating. Feedback loops.
Feedback loops. Right. Remind me about those again.
Imagine you set the faucet to a specific level. You think, okay, this will give me the perfect amount of water in the tub.
But then you find out there's a leak you didn't even know about.
Exactly. And that leak, that's creating a feedback loop. Water's constantly draining out, even as you're trying to fill it up.
So a feedback loop is essentially like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
Something changes in one part of the system,
Mhm.
and then it circles back and influences the original change.
Exactly. And Meadows describes two main types of feedback loops, balancing and reinforcing.
Oh, yeah, the thermostat. That's a balancing feedback loop, right?
Perfect example. It aims for stability,
It kicks in the heat when it's too cold, turns it off when it's too warm,
trying to find that sweet spot.
keeping things in equilibrium.
Now imagine a microphone
Okay.
getting too close to a speaker.
Yeah, that awful high-pitched squeal.
That's a reinforcing feedback loop in action. The sound from the speaker gets picked up by the microphone, amplified, sent back to the speaker, and it just keeps getting louder,
And louder,
out of control.
Mm-hmm.
So reinforcing feedback amplifies change, while balancing feedback tries to stabilize things.
Okay, that's a really clear explanation. Thanks for that.
No problem.
And I'm starting to see how these loops are at work everywhere, right?
Everywhere. In ecosystems, in economies, even in our social interactions.
Okay, this is a lot to process, but in a good way. It's giving me a whole new framework for understanding how things work.
It's a powerful way of thinking.
So where do we go from here? How do we actually start applying this systems thinking in the real world?
Well, that's where Meadows' Systems Zoo comes in handy. She gives us all these real-world examples to show us how these principles play out in different contexts. And that's what we'll be diving into next.
Perfect. Let's do it. All right, so we've got those basic building blocks of systems,
Yeah,
elements, interconnections, a purpose, and those feedback loops that can either stabilize or amplify change.
exactly.
I'm ready to see how this all works in the real world.
Yeah.
What's first up in Meadows Systems Zoo?
Let's actually stick with that thermostat analogy for a bit. It's a really good example of how even a simple system can have a lot of complexity.
Right, because remember, the goal is to keep that room at a comfortable temperature,
Yeah.
but it's not as simple as just flicking a switch. There are those balancing feedback loops
Right. The thermostat senses the temperature, tells the furnace to turn on or off.
to hit that sweet spot.
But what happens if things get a bit more
So
complicated?
give me a scenario.
Like, what if the furnace is old
Okay, old furnace.
and it's a freezing cold day? The thermostat keeps saying, hey, we need more heat,
Uh-huh.
but that poor furnace just can't keep up.
So even though the system is designed to maintain that stable temperature,
Yeah.
there are limits to what it can actually do.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. There are always limits.
Right. And I guess if we push a system beyond those limits, we're going to see those unintended consequences pop up.
Exactly. And this is a concept that applies to so many things.
I bet. From our personal finances to global climate change.
You got it. Understanding the capacity of each element in a system is crucial.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I'm curious about population growth.
Wait.
We talked about reinforcing feedback loops.
Yeah.
How do they play into this?
Well, population growth is a classic example of the interplay between reinforcing and balancing loops.
Okay.
So when the birth rate is higher than the death rate,
Uh-huh.
you have a reinforcing loop driving population growth.
More people means more babies.
More babies means more people, like that snowball effect.
But obviously, populations can't just grow forever. There have to be limits, right?
Of course. And that's where the balancing loops come in. As a population grows, it puts more and more pressure on resources, like food, water, space. Exactly. And that leads to competition, maybe even conflict.
And that drives up the death rate.
Slowing down the population growth.
Yeah.
So you have this constant push and pull between these two forces.
Reinforcing loop, pushing for growth, balancing loop, trying to keep things in check.
And the outcome. Well, it depends on which loop is stronger at any given time.
And this probably plays out in other systems too, right? Not just population dynamics.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the economy. We want growth, but unfettered growth.
Can lead to all sorts of problems.
Inflation, resource depletion, inequality. Those balancing loops kicking in, trying to restore some equilibrium.
Okay, so I'm starting to see these patterns now, but I'm still a bit fuzzy on those delays you mentioned.
Right.
Can we go back to that car dealership example?
Sure. Remember the goal. The dealer wants to have just the right number of cars on the lot.
To meet customer demand.
Right. So when they sell a car, that triggers a signal to order a new one. But there are these built-in delays.
Like the time it takes for the dealer to assess their sales trends,
Yeah.
and then the time it takes to actually place the order, get the car built and delivered.
Exactly. And those delays can create some interesting behaviors.
Like what?
Let's say sales suddenly spike. The dealer might not react immediately.
Wait a bit.
By the time they place that order, their inventory has dropped even lower.
They've got a shortage.
And then what happens? They might overcompensate,
Over-order.
leading to a surplus down the road.
It's like they're constantly playing catch-up.
Always trying to hit that moving target.
And I bet we see this in a ton of systems, right? Supply chains, government policies.
Absolutely. Those delays in getting information, making decisions, taking action.
They create those oscillations, those swings back and forth.
Exactly.
It makes me wonder, how do we respond to problems in our own lives? Do we jump into action too quickly? Do we wait too long?
Great question. Meadows' work really encourages us to think about these delays.
And to find ways to shorten them when we can.
The faster we can get information, make adjustments.
The better we can manage the system.
You got it.
Okay, so we've got thermostats, population growth, car dealerships. What other examples does Meadows give us?
Well, one that really makes you think is resource depletion.
Oh, this is a big one.
It shows how a system that seems to be doing great in the short term can actually collapse if it's not managed well.
Okay, can you walk me through an example?
Imagine a company. They rely on a non-renewable resource for their production.
Like oil or some kind of mineral?
At first, they're experiencing rapid growth. They're extracting more and more of the resource.
Profits are up.
They're reinvesting, expanding operations. Everything seems fantastic.
But we know those non-renewable resources are finite. What happens when they start running low?
That's when that reinforcing loop of growth hits a wall.
A hard limit.
The resource becomes scarcer, harder to extract, more expensive,
Profits take a hit.
and they might try to keep that growth going by extracting even more aggressively.
But that just speeds up the depletion.
Exactly. Short-term gains leading to long-term consequences.
And this isn't just about companies, right? This is playing out globally with deforestation, overfishing.
You're absolutely right. Meadows' work reminds us that we can't just look at isolated parts of a system.
We can't just focus on those short-term gains.
We need to consider the long-term impacts and how everything is connected.
This is pretty sobering stuff, but also really important. It makes you think about how we often try to just fix the symptoms without addressing the root causes.
And that's a common trap. Meadows actually dedicates a whole section of her book to what she calls system traps.
System traps. Okay, tell me more about these.
These are those common patterns of behavior that lead to unintended consequences.
And I'm guessing we all need to be aware of these. Can you give me some examples? How can we avoid falling into these traps? Okay, system traps. They sound kind of scary. What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, think about that Romanian abortion ban we mentioned earlier.
Right, they were trying to increase the birth rate.
It's a perfect example of what Meadows calls policy resistance.
Okay, policy resistance. How does that play out?
On the surface, it seemed like, okay, ban abortions, more babies.
Right. Seems pretty straightforward.
And initially, yeah, there was a spike in births, but then things got complicated.
What?
People found ways to work around the ban. The demand for illegal abortions just skyrocketed.
Putting women's health at risk.
And ultimately, it undermined the whole point of the policy.
It's a good reminder that people aren't just these passive elements in a system.
They adapt, they react, they find ways to get around those constraints. And sometimes those workarounds have, well, pretty bad unintended consequences.
That's a great point. I guess it shows how important it is to actually understand how people are going to behave
To consider those motivations.
before just trying to impose these top-down solutions.
Absolutely. We can't just assume people will react in a predictable way. We need to be flexible. Consider those unintended consequences.
Right, like you can't just force people to do what you want.
Exactly.
It makes you think about all those policies and initiatives that, even if they're well-intentioned, they can backfire
Oh, all the time.
because they just don't account for how complex human behavior really is.
And that brings us to another common trap,
Okay, hit me with it.
the tragedy of the commons.
Oh, yeah, the classic grazing pasture example. I remember this one.
Everyone's acting rationally,
In their own self-interest.
adding more and more cattle to the shared land.
And they end up overgrazing it, destroying it for everyone.
Exactly. Individual rationality leading to collective disaster.
And we see this all the time, right? Overfishing, deforestation, pollution.
Anywhere you have a shared resource,
That gets depleted because people are just prioritizing their own short-term gains.
without thinking about the long-term sustainability of the system.
So how do we prevent this? Is it even possible?
Well, Meadows suggests a couple of things. Privatization is one option.
Divide up the commons, give each person their own little piece.
So their incentives align with keeping that resource healthy,
But you can't really privatize everything.
like the atmosphere or the ocean.
Yeah, exactly. So what else can we do?
That's where regulation comes in, setting limits, enforcing those limits.
Like fishing quotas or pollution permits.
It's about finding that balance between individual freedom and the collective good.
It's a tough one. No easy answers there.
Nope. Every situation is going to require its own nuanced approach.
But the key takeaway is...
Recognize those dynamics. Be proactive.
Okay, so we've got policy resistance, tragedy of the commons. What other traps should we be watching out for?
Well, there's drift to low performance.
Drift to low performance. Okay,
Yeah.
tell me about that one.
This happens when standards gradually erode over time.
I can see how that would be a problem.
Think of a company.
Okay.
They start cutting corners to save money. Maybe they use cheaper materials, or they reduce training for their employees.
At first, it's probably not that noticeable.
Maybe the customers don't even realize.
But over time, the quality keeps dropping.
And the danger is people start to accept that lower standard as the new normal.
Like, oh, well, this is just how it is now.
Exactly. So the next time they propose a cost-cutting measure,
They can justify it more easily.
the bar's already been lowered.
This is making me think about how we set expectations.
Yeah.
For ourselves, for our relationships, for our communities.
If we're not careful, We can get stuck in that cycle of lowering expectations, settling for less than we deserve.
That's a really powerful insight. It's like we need to be vigilant about maintaining those standards, even when it's easier to just let things slide.
Absolutely. Hold ourselves accountable.
Like policy resistance, tragedy of the commons, drift to low performance. What's the last trap we need to know about?
Let's talk about escalation. This one often comes up in competitive situations,
Okay, escalation. Give me an example.
like an arms race between two countries.
Classic example.
One country builds up its military,
Right. The other country feels threatened.
so they build up their military even more.
It's that vicious cycle of trying to one-up each other.
And it can spiral out of control, leading to, well, some pretty devastating consequences.
I mean, we see this everywhere, right? Business rivalries, political campaigns, even personal relationships.
It's like everyone gets caught up in that game, and they don't know how to stop.
So we've covered a lot today. Those building blocks of systems thinking.
The feedback loops, the system traps.
It's been a lot to take in, but I'm starting to really see the power of this framework.
It's not just about understanding how systems work,
It's about changing them.
for the better.
Yeah.
And that's where those leverage points come in.
Those places where even small changes can have a big impact.
Meadows lays out this whole hierarchy of leverage points,
Starting with things like parameters.
like tweaking interest rates or subsidies.
Those can be effective, but their impact is often limited.
Then you have interventions that aim to change the structure of the system itself,
Redesigning those feedback loops, changing the flow of information,
or even challenging the goals of the system.
and the most powerful leverage points, she says.
Operate at the level of paradigms.
Those deeply held beliefs about how the world works.
So if we really want to create lasting change,
We have to examine our own assumptions, our own mental models.
it's about transforming our understanding of the system, not just tweaking it.
That's where the real magic happens.
It's a constant process of questioning, learning, evolving our perspectives.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you for walking me through all of this.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
I feel like I have a whole new toolkit for understanding the world.
Remember, even small changes in the right places can make a difference.
I love that. It's really inspiring. And to everyone listening, I highly recommend checking out Donella Meadows' book.
Thinking in systems.
It's a journey well worth taking. Thanks for joining us.